Good morning, beautiful people of the Center for Spiritual Living. There is something about the message of Easter that seems to resonate across all denominations, says the Reverend Edward Fillion of the Center for Spiritual Living in the Press Democrat this morning. This interfaith Santa Rosa congregation has roots in the New Thought movement of the 19th century and the ideas of transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. That's correct. He says, it has something to do with this being a time of renewal and the hope of things to come. And it all comes after a long period of introspection. He continues to say, which was so beautifully characterized in the story of Jesus of Nazareth. For Christians, Easter is the most holy of days, and the story of death, entombment, and resurrection can be embraced for its powerful metaphors, whatever one's faith is. One such metaphor is the idea of conquering death, and depending on the individual, he said, it could represent the hope of surviving smaller deaths, like, for example, the loss of a relationship or of a vision or of hope. Fillion says, this year I'm asking people to recommit to their spiritual practice, not in a random way, and not just to turn to it in times of need, he said, but to practice it on a regular basis, to build their faith muscle so that when difficulties do emerge, they don't get blindsided because they already know where to turn for strength. And there you have it. You didn't even need to come to church today. I guess, a down. It's actually a commentary on our whole theme this year, as well as our message today, which I would summarize like this. It goes like this. Practice, 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 because you're going to need it. Right? So I got the main points of my message today so I don't forget them. I'll put them up here. It goes like this. First of all, the message of Easter for me is this. Take heart, because something has to give way in me in order for something else to arise. And the second point is, so, Edward, don't rush through that time in between beginnings and endings, because it can be a rich value experience in that. And thirdly, that when it's over, whatever it is, whatever that thing is, when it's over, life isn't over with it. That this is a never-ending story, forever and ever. Amen. So let's get to it, shall we? It's true what the article says. I do appreciate the Easter message because it does remind me that there is life after whatever particular ending I might currently be struggling with. And that our lives are, it's a journey of transformation that is characterized by beginnings, followed by endings, followed by beginnings, followed by endings, followed by beginnings, followed by endings. And some people just manage quite lovely with that. So this is the Easter question. How well do you do with endings and beginnings? You don't have to answer out loud. Other people dig their heels into it and they resist whatever change they know must happen, whether that's a beginning or an ending or that place in between. So I'm going to ask you to see if you can identify yourself. Where do you do better, and could you do better with these various phases of endings and beginnings? Some people resist the end, and so they drag it out. Some people resist a new beginning, so they never ever start anything new. Some people resist the quiet time, the space in between the two, and busy themselves with doing absolutely anything else. Oh, cheer up. It's Easter. Or how about this? Some people rush through endings. just to get it over with and leave a trail of bodies behind them. And some people rush to new beginnings. Any new start will do. And some people rush through that quiet time in between the two, imagining they tell themselves that they are further along than they really are. Or some people get stuck in the ending. Yeah, and they never ever move on. And some people get stuck in the idea of beginning, so they're constantly starting over and over and over, whereas other people get stuck in the space in between, and they stay there longer than they ought to. They overstay their time in the tomb. Personally, I get stuck all over the map. Personally, I don't like endings, so I avoid them at all costs. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah. In fact, I don't like movies or books with unhappy endings. I don't like them. In fact, sometimes Chris and I will watch a movie together, but it's such a big deal to choose a movie because he has to be able to tell me if it has a happy ending. Otherwise, I won't watch it. I'm not wasting my time. All that build up for unhappy, I'm not doing it. And so as a result of this affliction, I sometimes in life put up with unhappy situations for much longer than I ought to. I'm long past the time when I should move on. And while I'm at it, I can tell you, I don't like stories in which the most important character has to die in order for that which needs to happen to happen. I don't like it. Does anybody here watch Downton Abbey? It's a celebrated PBS TV series. And my problem is that recently they've been killing off very popular characters. And I would like them to stop that. Although I and we all know that they have to. I mean, take, for example, the Dowager Aunt, Cousin Violet. I mean, she hasn't aged a day through the whole thing. And we've been through the introduction of electricity and cars and telephones and great-grandchildren, and she's still there, and she's just exactly as she ever was. So I know eventually she's going to have to go. And I don't know how I'm going to cope with it when it happens. And that's a humorous way of talking about one of the most tender parts of the Easter story. It goes like this. There are times when I, and that can be any one of us, cling to the beloved present moment. And I feel unsettled by not knowing what will come, even though I know that it will come. And that something is going to have to give way in order for something new to emerge. Oh, it can be so tender being a human being. I acknowledge that. And it certainly was the case for Jesus. And yet, when we acknowledge that, how tender it is, how vulnerable it is, it makes it all the easier for us to hold it just as it is. And maybe you see a little of yourself in this part of the endings and beginnings challenge. Here's what I do. After something has ended, I do what the second point over here advises against. I rush on to the next thing too quickly. I skip over that time that comes between beginnings and endings. I have a friend who used to refer to himself as a serial monogamist. By that he meant as soon as one relationship was over, he would instantly get into another one. He was very skilled at it. I wondered how he did it. Because in those times, I couldn't even get a date, and he was already exchanging rings. I was like, how do you do that? And later on, when we were able to have a conversation about it, he explained very vulnerably that he would step right over the period in between because he acknowledged that he just couldn't face being alone with himself in the darkness of his own despair. I understand that. And the problem with rushing ahead to the new beginning is that in so doing, we may not have adequate time to take in what happened, to learn from it, to grow from it, to be transformed by it so we can emerge from it, to properly mourn it so that we can accept it and understand that it has passed. So in those days, both of us would end up moving too quickly onto our next beginning, and in so doing, we would take with us our unhealed past, whether it was to a new relationship or a new project, but we would arrive unprepared. So my new approach is this: when something ends, to pause, to stand still in that pause, because it's a time of not knowing, of not doing. And it takes as long as it takes, as long as I don't get stuck in it. I remember learning about the Easter story when I was a young man and interested in metaphysics and religion. I didn't like to focus so much on the death and entombment part of the story. I thought it to be too morbid. I wanted to rush ahead to the resurrection. And now I see it's not either or. It's a big picture. It's both and. Without death, there is no life. And without the entombment, there is no healthy return. So I say to myself now, Edward, take heart. But something has to give way so that something new can emerge. And Edward, I say, don't rush through the bits in between. Because even though it's ended, whatever that something is, life isn't ended with it. It's not over. Your story is a never-ending story, because that is the way of things. I've been writing curriculum. You heard Reverend Joyce refer to it for one of the new upcoming classes. The title is Make Me an Instrument of Your Peace, Living the Prayer of St. Francis. And I'm really enjoying it. It's based on the book by the same title by Kent Nerburn. And in it, he talks about the relationship between things as expressed in the prayer. How there are cycles, how one thing yields to the other. Like giving is the other side of receiving, and forgiving and being forgiven are connected. And the dying and reemerging is part of one big picture. And the last three lines of the prayer refer to it, and I brought them along so we can read them together. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in forgiving that we are forgiven, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And I think many people, when they read that line about dying and being born, they refer to in their minds the ending of this physical body and then emerging on the other side of this experience in some radiant way. But what I want to do today is I want to expand that from the hereafter to the here and now, and see that this is a comment on how our life is, a cycle endlessly of emerging. When I was making those notes, I remembered that well overused metaphor of the caterpillar who dies to become the butterfly. Remember, it was on every single card, and when I first encountered that, I thought, great, that's wonderful, and I just wanted to stop there because the message was, we're all going to get our wings and be butterflies. But I had to lean deeper into it, deeper into the metaphor, to follow it through, because it doesn't end there. No, it doesn't end with the butterfly. In reality, the butterfly dies again to the caterpillar, and each subsequent butterfly must head to that dark, quiet, and radical time of transformation, and in the cocoon must give way to yet another slug. You see, it's not over. That's what eternal means to me in these points. It's not over. Here and now is what eternal means, forever and ever. The cycle of life goes on. It's never done. The story goes on. Your story is not done. What, you think because you got your wings it's done? You think because your life feels like a slug's life right now that you're done? No, it's not over. We die to the changes of our life so that we can emerge from state to state to state to state. And I think the trick or the skill is to stop frustrating the process, to not fight it. How? By interfering with it, by interfering with the process. Here's another question. How do you interfere with the cycles of change and emergence in your life? I know how I do. We probably all got our own thing we do. I was inspired recently by reading an article. The title of it was 10 Things You Can Stop Doing Immediately to Make Yourself Be Happier. And as I was reading it, I realized I could very easily make my own list of 10 things that I do to interfere with the flow and process of life. And so I set about making the list, and oh my, I was surprised by how easy it was to come up with this list. So this is my list. It's not the same for everybody. Maybe you can make your own list. I'll share a few of the things that are on my list for how I interrupt the flow of endings and beginnings and the cycles of connected life. Number 1, stop holding on too tightly. One day, a friend of mine called me a Klingon. Now, he was humorously referring to the fictional warrior race in Star Trek, and I don't think it was because I looked like one, although I don't know. It was because, as he said, I would cling on and cling on and cling on to anything and to anyone. And although we laughed at the moment about the cleverness of the phrase, I never forgot that moment. I clung on to it. Because, I was changed by that utterance. I started to notice how clinging stops momentum. It arrests progress. And so I started to let go just from hearing that phrase. More accurately, I just started to let things be. And in so doing, I opened up into my life such a rush of movement and such a rush of freedom that I couldn't imagine. And I couldn't imagine because I was so busy clinging on how it should be. Oh. You want to see what's number 2 on my list? Stop complaining. Complaining to me has got sticky energy. It causes things to not be able to move. That was my experience. I had an aunt, beautiful soul, so generous and so kind and just wonderful. And yet she complained as a way of expressing herself, to the point that being with her felt sticky in her environment because nothing could move. Because every complaint demanded attention, had to be addressed. And so there was this energy of stuckness. And so when I started to reduce the amount of complaining I was willing to allow to come through me, and I'm still working on it, I noticed that in that act, much of my complaining was attached to not letting things move. Oh, and it takes vulnerability and tenderness to stop complaining. It takes courage to find another way to express. The third thing on my list, stop longing for a better past. I don't really need to say anything, do I? As if we can do anything to change the past. We can't. Or can we? You see, a friend of mine shared with me this notion that helped me very much. He said, actually, when you commit completely to the present, the past does change because it loses its power. Oh, I needed to hear that because it gave me the inspiration to begin to unhook from the past. And in so doing, I saw just how much physical, emotional, mental energy I was investing into rethinking the past, rehashing it, and wishing that it would have played out better. Oh, what a rush forward. Things began to move so quickly in my life when I started to land a little more solidly in the here and now, where I could learn to go with the flow, to forgive, to be here, to connect, which is why I'm going to love next month's theme. Forgiveness as a spiritual practice. And as you heard Reverend Joyce say, on Wednesday, the first Wednesday, we're going to be handing out this free resource for a month of forgiveness as a spiritual practice. Not as a once-off thing that you do, but as a way of being in the flow of life's graces. There are other things on my list. I'll just share a few of them with you. They include this. Stop having no quiet time in your day for spiritual practice, Edward. You want to have difficulty with endings and beginnings and the place in between? Try deal with them without spiritual practice. You want to be stuck in a tomb? Carry on trying to make other people be different. You will not emerge. Stop putting other people down. Stop criticizing yourself when you make errors. And so on. The list goes on. But really the point is, what's on your list? How do you try to control change? This is where people look at each other in the audience, looking at partners. I tell you what happened for me in making this list is it helped me to see how over the years some of these things I've had to give up, and as I've given way for them so that something new could emerge, it wasn't always comfortable, because as I surrendered some of these self-defeating habits, what followed was the opening up of an unfamiliar space, a spaciousness that I felt unsure in, unsteady, disoriented. And so I'm learning over and over again to be still during those moments and to stand and to not rush through it. And as a result of that, I think I'm becoming less afraid of endings, less afraid of the space between, less afraid of new beginnings, less afraid of the unknown, more in love with now. In the little book that we're going to be using for the class on St. Francis prayer, he writes something about it specifically. I invite you to read it with me. If we look for the deaths that free us to something new and better, we are less inclined to look upon death with fear and more inclined to embrace it with hope. And that certainly reminds me of the reading from the text that Sherry shared with us this morning, in particular the words, accepting the lessons and experiences of the past and taking the best from everything, we should press boldly forward, looking ever for the truth and ever ascending higher and higher. There is no limit to the possibility inherent in us. So let us put our complete trust in good and press bravely on, tenderly on, vulnerably on. So this Easter, I'm trying to keep that in mind, that somewhere between my fear of the unknown and my doubt that I will survive the change and my attachment to what is currently going on, somewhere in between all of that, there is something new trying to emerge. And to hold that tenderly, excitedly, vulnerably. For my own use, I made an adaptation of the Serenity Prayer Reinhold Niebuhr's prayer, to use at times when transformation troubles me, or at times when I know I have to let go of something but I don't want to. And it goes like this, and it's small writing, so those of you at the front, read it out with me so the ones in the back can enjoy it too, together. Spirit's wisdom within me gives me the peace to embrace the things I cannot control. Spirit's strength within me gives me the courage to change the things I can, as well as the wisdom to know the difference between the two. And so I live one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, seeing hardships for what they are. I take this world as it is, instead of insisting it be anything different. Trusting that goodness has made all things perfectly, I surrender to what is so that I may live in peace in this world and the next. And I invite you to breathe in with me. And exhaling, if you feel comfortable, let your eyes close so that we may enter into a moment of prayer, acknowledging our own relationship to that one, whether we call it goodness or God or life or higher power or whatever it is, the ground of all being. Identifying it as everywhere present, constantly renewing itself and its expression of itself. And as we identify with that, calling ourselves the inheritor, the ones who inherit, there you go, the ones who inherit that kingdom of newness. We let ourselves sink into a flow of renewal, finding our hearts, finding our love, and trusting it. And so it is that this prayer is establishing us in our strength and wisdom so that we may take our stand within the community of beings, feeling warmly inclined to those that are already close to us in our lives, our families and friends and extended family. And in so doing, that light brightens so that we may extend that love and that compassion further on, further out, in widening circles. And we become transformed together by this re-emerging identity, this reawakening to who we are. We find again the truth in our own souls of the statement, my peace is found at the heart of God, and the heart of God for me is found at the very center of my being. And we lean into that. And in gratitude, we let it all be just as it is, and just as it is not. And together we say, and so it is.